working at Off-Chain Labs on the Prism consensus client. And today I would like to tell you how core devs crashed Ethereum, or what happened when the Holesky testnet got updated to Pectra. So we first need to understand small prerequisites. So validators, apart from voting on the head of the chain, they also cast something called an FFG vote. And everyone knows this picture. There are epochs. Epochs consist of slots, but apart from that, there are also this notion of checkpoints. And each epoch has one checkpoint, and it's the first block of the epoch, or if the block is missing, it's the second block, and so on and so forth. Here in the diagram, we can see checkpoints for epoch n and epoch n+1. And whenever you cast this FFG vote, a validator says that there's a pair of a source checkpoint and a target checkpoint. And a checkpoint can be in three states. It can be either finalized, justified, or neither finalized nor justified. And so if a checkpoint is justified, such as here in epoch n+1, and validators cast the votes from that say that the source is in epoch n, they casted votes that the source is in epoch n and the target is epoch n+1, and more than two-thirds of validators casted that vote, then the checkpoint at epoch n got justified, okay? And then later on, you can imagine the same arrow going from checkpoint n+1 to n+2, again with more than two-thirds of validators, and that justified checkpoint n+1 and finalized checkpoint n. And so if a checkpoint is finalized, then blocks before that checkpoint cannot be reverted anymore unless at least one-third of the whole stake gets slashed. And let's imagine this scenario. A validator casted its vote where it said the source is at epoch 1 and the target is at epoch 2. And then later on, they cast a vote saying the source is at epoch 0 and the target is at epoch 3. Now this is something called a surround vote, and you can't do that. For security reasons, if you do that, then you get slashed. So a validator would never do that, and clients have something called a slashing protection, which prevents validators from casting such a vote incidentally. So now that we know that, we can turn to Holesky and see what actually happened over there. So what happened was initially 0x42424242, etc., which was the deposit contract address on Holesky. Now, when we were updating to Pectra, Get, Nethermind, and Besu execution layer clients, they did not set the configuration value of the deposit contract to this value. And Red and Oregon did. And so because of that, we had a fork. Get, Nethermind, and Besu accepted that block that was supposed to be invalid. And Red and Oregon did not accept it. Now you could say that's not a big deal, because these clients who have a debug can just release a patch, and we can all go back to the valid fork and be happy. Well, the problem is that because they had more than 70% of the stake, so more than two-thirds, so validators running these clients had more than two-thirds of the stake, and so the chain could get justified, and it got justified. So the invalid fork got justified before they released the patches. And so what happened is something like this. So the validators on the bad fork voted with the source at epoch 1 and target at epoch 2, and then after updating to the patch, they would vote for the source at epoch 0 and target at epoch 3, and all of them would get slashed. So if they turned off their slashing protection, or if they turned off their validators altogether and would like to turn them back on, they will get slashed. Apart from these consensus layer or consensus issues, clients also had issues. So first of all, from Prism's perspective, we had problems finding peers on the valid fork initially, because most of our peers were on the invalid fork. Then we had this issue of falling back to syncing, because the valid fork the last block of the valid fork was before the last block of the invalid fork. And so when we got to the head and we had most of the peers on the invalid fork, they were telling us, hey, I know a block which is much higher than your block. And Prism would try to get all these blocks and switch to the invalid fork. Now, finally, when everyone got back on the fork where we should have been since the start, there was a problem with the very long non-finality, right? Because the last finality occurred before the fork happened, and it was already a couple of hundreds, thousands of blocks. And this caused problem because what clients usually do is they store all non-finalized data in memory. So meaning that the longer we have non-finality, the bigger the resources that the clients are using, and both for memory, for CPU. And also on the valid fork, there was about 2,000 consecutive slots without blocks. And this is not your regular case. So Prism was not prepared for that, meaning that the paths for empty slots were not optimized enough. And this caused also a lot of resource usage when we were churning through these 2,000 empty slots. Okay, so we have these issues. Now, how do we fix this? So first of all, we can fix Prism. So the first thing is we added an option to blacklist bad blocks. Now, it's kind of technical why this is necessary, but the thing is that if you sync with something called an optimistic sync, where the execution layer that can't really tell you yet, because it hasn't synced enough state yet, if the execution portion of the block is valid or not. If you receive a bad block, you send it to the execution layer saying, this is the head of my chain, it will just accept it. And then you will keep on building on the bad block. And then after a while, once the execution layer syncs enough of the state to tell you, hey, this block, 5,000 blocks in the past was invalid, Prism would try this very long reorg of a couple of thousand of blocks, and it would just crash. It wouldn't work. So we had to explicitly say, hey, this block, that block is invalid, so that we are not accepting it from our peers. Secondly, even if we're on the correct fork, whenever you restart Prism, or restarted Prism, it started from the last finalized checkpoint, which was quite some time ago. So even though we had all blocks in our database, we would be on the correct fork. We would process these blocks, but every single time when we restarted, we had to process these blocks again and again and again, and it took time and resources. And so we added an option to sync from an arbitrary block, and you can, for example, specify head, and then it would just start syncing from the head. And lastly, the internal caches that we had were not prepared for such long non-finality because there were limits in how much data these caches can store. And so we needed to patch them and add some more, increase the sizes of them so that they can handle this problematic scenario. Now, what about Holesky? This is a much bigger issue, right? So, because these bad validators that voted on the bad fork are more than 2/3, that means that we can't reach 66% of participation without them, and we can't justify or finalize the valid fork so that Holesky can restore. And there are basically two options that we can consider. First option is we make all of them get slashed at once. So we kind of coordinate a mass slashing event. And what this will give us is that they will get these bad validators, they will get slashed. They will be, unfortunately, they don't get removed immediately because that would just save us, but they get put through an exit queue. So it will take some time before they are exited from the chain, and the good validators now will get to 66%. But if we coordinate a mass slashing, then there's something called a slashing correlation penalty, when if many validators make a slashing at the same time, the penalties that they get are multiplied. And so that's why this correlated slashing is a good idea. And secondly, there's also an option that the slasher, gossiping of slashing, putting slashings into blocks doesn't work perfectly. In which case, if all the bad validators get up, they can vote once, so we can justify for sure. Then they should get slashed. But if initially we have enough participation, maybe we can get to the next epoch with still more than 66% of the network, including, which means good validators and bad validators that haven't yet been slashed, and they can vote again, and we can finalize the good fork. We would still have to wait then until the good ones have 66%, but at least we could restart our internal state, right? Because we could prune everything that has been finalized. The second option is to just wait, in which case these bad validators, they would, after some time, get a penalty called an inactivity leak because they're not voting, not doing anything, and they would slowly get ejected to the exit queue. Now, more or less, these options would take 20 to 30 days before Holesky can get restored, since this event happened. And so what we decided is option one is better. So we got together, tried to coordinate this mass slashing, wanted to get to 66%, and got to 53. So unfortunately, this didn't work. And we kind of had no options left. We couldn't deposit new validators because there's a part of the specs saying that you need to have finalization after you deposit. So in order for the validator to become active, so we can't really deposit new validators when there's non-finality. And so, yeah, what now? So the first thing is we need to wait until Holesky gets restored if we want to continue the chain. And eventually on March 10th, which was 10 days after the slashing event, we were able to finalize Holesky. It got finalized, and we could keep it as our consensus layer testnet. But the problem was that the state that the Holesky was in was not really good enough to test for the real hard fork. And also, if you look at it, initially it had like 1 million validators, and to get back to that state of 1 million validators distributed through consensus clients and staking pools, etc., and regular users, it will take about a year for Holesky to redeposit all of these validators. And so instead of that, a new testnet called Hoodie was introduced. And so Hoodie with 1 million validators was just like a copy of Holesky with validators redistributed as Holesky had. And yeah, and now Hoodie took the place of Holesky as the main consensus layer testnet. It was just the overall, I think, easiest and best way forward at that time. So lastly, let's think about what have we learned from that. So firstly, we learned that we need better validation of configuration, that's for sure. So either manually or automatically with some tooling, or better yet, all of these combined. Yeah, we need to make sure that such a configuration error never happens again. This custom checkpoint syncing, where you can specify a custom block, is very helpful, not maybe in this scenario, maybe in some future problems or for debugging. So that's a good flag for all clients to have in the future. And very importantly, as part of our testing schedule for the next hard fork, we should definitely test non-finality periods in terms of can clients handle long periods of non-finality, because all clients found all sorts of bugs during this Holesky problem. And this is best utilized on a devnet, which is not publicly facing. And so even if there are issues, and finally, it doesn't have to be stopped on a public testnet, and yeah, and we can just restart the devnet whenever we feel like, if things don't work out. And lastly, we need some better incident response, or some standard incident response, so that in case a similar situation happens in the future, there is no panic, everyone knows what to do. And these lessons learned points I have extracted from a post-mortem, which is available on the Ethereum Foundation's GitHub. And other than that, there are also post-mortems from client teams, from Prism. I know there's one from Lighthouse, and probably from other clients as well. OK, that's all I had for today. Thank you so much. Yes, if we have time for questions, then I see a hand raised.
Just here. OK. Is there a mechanism in clients that would maybe prevent new block creation if well, the chain is not finalized for some period of time? Like, for example, if finalization stopped, then we kind of decrease the the ratio. We are not anymore creating blocks every 12 seconds, but then we can create them like twice as less, and then again twice as less, and so on, so that we kind of you don't face this issue of like running out of memory as you described. Is there something like that, and would it help if it was in place?
No, there's nothing like that. So you need to have 12-second slots and 1 block per slot. Would it help? There's a limit on how many attestations, so votes, you can put per block. So if you have blocks, yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you have blocks spread out more, then I think you would get less votes. But other than that, like something like you described would be a really major change to the specification, because it would affect everything on how to vote, how to propose blocks, etc. So I think it's not really something feasible to do, in my opinion.
It's just some chains are doing that. That's why I'm just saying that. Yeah, thanks.
Another one? No more question? Yes?
First of all, thanks for your talk. I had been in a similar situation in different blockchains, so as an incident manager, so you have the commiserations from our teams, because I think that might be stressful. So I wanted to ask you, because you showed your slide about the lessons learned in terms of processes and these kind of things. Can you maybe go a little bit into the human part of things, how you guys pull through into these aspects, how hard was to actually coordinate across teams, how was the, what are the things that you recognize that in this disaster recovery scenario that you make actually guys succeed into finding a solution?
Yeah, I think it was very hard to coordinate, especially the mass slashing thing, where not everyone was on board even, like, is this the bad idea? Is this a good idea? Will it help us? Will it not help us? And then, how to coordinate between also not only client teams, but also like no staking pools, etc. Please turn off your slashing protection. Please turn on all your validators and this and that time. That will speed up the recovery of the testnet. And I would also say that even though it was of course stressful, but at some point we kind of knew that it's not going to work, meaning that, probably Holesky is dead. Because from the very beginning, it was apparent that even if we did the slashings or wait, we need this many days to recover, and it would prolong the hard fork. And so it was a good testing ground for non-finality thing and a potential recovery. But we kind of knew at some point that we would probably need to launch a new testnet anyhow, because Holesky was just in such a bad state already that, and it was pretty close to a hard fork, that we couldn't really afford waiting like several months for everything to stabilize, and so that the staking pool strata could just start testing everything again. So yeah, it was stressful, but I think at some point we just knew that it's more of a test right now, and we're going to start with something fresh.
Okay, thank you.